within following my spiritual path, which was based very much on Middle Eastern Sufism, syncretized with Buddhism and Hinduism in Java. It's been a pathway that has involved both my own spiritual evolution and my own personal growth. Over the past, I'd say 20 years or so, I've been given the privilege of being invited into the indigenous communities from across the country. So I've been invited into learning those traditions from numbers of different cultures and been brought in from a ceremonial standpoint, a ritual standpoint, and then with my own studies on shamanism throughout the world. The indigenous world is steeped in viewing and experiencing nature as a living, intelligent, self-aware, mission-oriented, in other words, he or she, however you gender nature, definitely has a sense of purpose, as all living beings have a sense of purpose. So I was very fascinated looking at Jung's sort of marrying, in a sense, his psychology with nature, with Jung's psychology very, very much informing my work. I also bring in my indigenous and my mystical training. I hold true to my own personal commitment and relationship with Earth as a living, breathing, intelligent being who I'm deeply embedded into, and also as a spiritual being. Henri Corbin, he studied the Zoroastrian traditions. He combined that with medieval Islamic Sufism, which is the mystical tradition of Islam. He articulates and he identifies what I'm talking about in terms of Earth being a living creature upon whose body we live and within whose being we function, as Earth in her angel. And I just love that term, so I actually use that term a lot. In the same sense that we are spiritual beings who reside in our physical bodies, in the same sense that I gender her as female because that's the nature of my relationship with her. I see her as a spiritual being residing in her body being, which is this planet. I really try to keep that presence and connectedness with the fact that we live on her physical being, but then also the fact too that our souls interact and engage with, if we wish, at the level of her soul being. And that's where the magic happens. That's where the shamanic experiences begin to unfold, the revelatory experiences, those intuitive journeys. And really not for everyone necessarily, because we all have our own metaphorical world. We all articulate and describe our experience of connectedness with the divine based on our own cultural realities, language of metaphor and symbol. But for those people that have really found a living relationship that's grounded in sacredness with nature, with Earth, then those people are going to understand it. I mean, there are people that live their lives and really have no perceived connection with nature or with Earth. And I think that, like anything else that has to do with connectedness, whether it's an experience, a moment, a need, a longing for connectedness with your own self, or whether it's a feeling of that you're missing something, that there's sort of this dark hole in your everyday existence, that it's really about the call. If one feels a longing that's mysterious, that you don't quite know how to even put into words, it's really about a longing for the call in that kind of universal, mystical, spiritual, inner, deep way, and you don't know where that call is going to come from, and you don't know what path you're going to be called down. So that for some of us, the path might in fact be a reconnection with earth, to find the sacred. We're called there to find God, if that's your terminology for the divine. God calls you through nature. For other people, that call may come in a very different way. It may come through good works, like with Mother Teresa. It may come through good works, and it's not really about waxing eloquent and spiritual about the blossoming cherry tree, but it's really about holding in your arms that dying leper, in Calcutta. And that's her moment of connection and union with the divine, is in that moment looking at that person's eyes. And your path may be an intellectual path, like Joseph Campbell or Deepak Chopra, or some of these sort of incredibly articulate and scholarly spiritual people. That's how it's coming through them. That's how it's speaking through them. So a city dweller, the divine may show up in sort of extraordinary, interesting ways. A tender moment for a homeless person in an alleyway. I remember I was in Washington, D.C. some years ago. It was late at night on a street where there was just, nightclubs and parties, people having fun in many ways. And it was a little bit scary because there was a lot of exchanges going on corners, and money put into pockets and working women on the street, the whole thing. And I was walking through this concrete world, which is not really my natural world, and looking at the garbage lined sideways and the grease by the cars and the puddles, and in the sidewalk there was a crack, and there was this tiny little green thing, perfect, 2 exact little leaves. And I looked at it, and to me that was God right there. That was divinity in its form as nature, in its form as earth, in its form as a tiny little living being, struggling for light in the midst of this sort of terrifyingly dangerous place, right? And here's this little tiny living green thing that's just shooting up, has no idea where it is, but it's shooting up. And to me, that was my moment, of thank you for showing me this second of beauty and reminding me where my natural ground is, where my natural world is. And I bless that little green creature. I bless however long its life and effort is, and I thank it for the gift of the moment. But each of us has to know our own nature. And in knowing our own nature, we then can look for the things in life that mirror that nature. And that's where the peaceful walk is. And then there's everything else. Then there's karma and your destiny. And are you destined to walk a peaceful path, At some point, you've got to descend into the abyss. You've got to climb down there, and you've got to face yourself. So the thing about really understanding and knowing who you are and learning about your true nature is seated in, I think pretty much every creation story is the question of why is there good and evil, and why within myself and within every human being is there an equal predilection toward good and evil. The whole process of learning your true nature is exactly the same as self-discovery. And part of our struggle as human beings, and that's where the mystery lies, because we really have no idea, is that we come into this world and we are pretty much immediately faced with these dichotomies, right? We're faced with this sort of internal struggle of being a good girl or a bad girl, a good boy or a bad boy. You did something wrong or you did something right. We grow up in that polarized place. And within that process, I think, depending on our life experience, will depend how far away and how continuingly distanced we become from our true nature which I believe every human being knows when we come into this world. In my experience as a tiny little child, I knew exactly who I was. And I knew my nature, and I knew why I had come into this world. I had come into this world as a singer, a praiser, a thanksgiving being. My job was to give praises and thanksgiving to the Creator. I came in to sing praises, and that was pretty much knocked out really soon. And it's been my painful struggle to get back to even being able to open my voice and sing. I mean, I lost my voice at 8 years old. And prior to that, I was a little singer. I mean, truly, we were all grooming me to be the next Shirley Temple. I was singing with big bands and everything. And then something dreadful happened to me that shut my voice down completely. I mean, I remember the day, I remember the evening that I locked myself in the girls' room and did not come out for the show because something happened to me that day. And I couldn't go out in public anymore in that way where you completely expose yourself when you're on the stage. And so I spent the rest of my life getting back to the singer who sings songs of praises to the creation and to the divine. But each of us has our own version of that. And so we have to get back to what I think we all knew when we were small children. We all knew. And then the way of the mystery of the human experience in this world, the world that the Buddha says, the world of suffering and attachment and heartache and old age and illness, that's just one way of putting it. But, you come into this world precisely to lose the thing you came in with, which was your gift. Who knows why? I don't think we ever will. But the job is to get back to ourselves. And however we do that is, once again, it goes back. The miracle is for those people that no matter what happens in your life, no matter how encased you get in materiality or your pain or your hurt or your disappointments or your betrayals or your greed, your lust, your addictions, I mean, all the stuff, that there are some people miraculously that didn't forget. I mean, you may not know how to get back there, but miraculously you didn't forget. Those are the blessed people. Because it's in that not forgetting. In other words, you can reach back there. That's where the call comes. To me, that's why that we need to go back to our inner child. We need to make that journey back to find that memory, because in that place and in that moment where you come back to that sort of little unadulterated being, that from there you reach out and you say, who am I? From there. And sometimes we need to make the call. Sometimes we need to cry out from that place. And we need to say, will you show me the way? Who are you? I mean, whatever your question is, from that place. And then wait for that response. Part of knowing your nature can also be really, really simple. It can be an everyday reality where, you meet someone. Are you somebody that immediately goes up and says, hi, I'm so pleased to meet you. How are you? And do you have a family? Or are you somebody that waits until the person comes up to you and says, hello, how are you? And then how do you respond? You know your nature. There's a little bit of your nature in there. I'm a forward-moving, open, initiatory person. Oh, I'm actually a rather shy, reticent, careful, cautious person. I don't easily open, I don't easily give forth. That's your nature. And of course, that's interwoven with your personality. It's interwoven with your learned behavior. It's interwoven with your given intention. in a given moment. And ideally, it's interwoven with cultivating kindness and compassion. So that if you're in a situation with people, because you're moving from a ground of kindness and compassion, no matter what your nature, your personality, you're taking that other person into consideration before yourself. That's part of your spiritual training and spiritual practice, is that if we're coming from a ground of love and kindness and compassion, that you read the person that you're interacting with, or you sense collectively the energy of the circle or the crowd or the environment. You sense your placement in that. Once you know yourself and you know your nature, that it's then your imperative to be that. That's your ground of information that informs you in any given moment. It's also a ground of being self-compassionate, being self-understanding. Say you're a really outgoing person and you weren't sensitive, and you were in a situation where you didn't take the time to feel out or sense out another person's reality, and you go in there kind of like a bull in a china shop, and you're there and you're hugging and shaking hands and asking all kinds of personal questions, etc. For another person would be great, but for this person, because you haven't taken the time to really sense where this person's at, it's putting them in an incredibly difficult situation. And then you might, in the middle of it, get it and then retract and move back. You might be tempted to sort of, get self-castigating, self-critical. Why did I act like this? Why did I say that? How could I be so insensitive? But understanding your nature and directing that compassion, sensitivity, and kindness to yourself, you give yourself a break. And that's part of knowing and loving who you are, too. It's sort of a multi-dimensional sense of being. One dimension is just knowing the truth of who you are. A dramatic example of that. Suppose you go back to that inner child. And what you discover about yourself is that your true nature is to be a warrior. And I don't mean metaphorically. No, you know that you've come here to soldier. You've come here to defend and to fight and to die if necessary for the thing that life's put you here for, right? But you've grown up in a peacenik hippie household. You weren't allowed to play with guns. Your mom didn't take you to kung fu. She took you to ballet. Your mom didn't take you to the local kendo where you learned the sword of the samurai teaching. You went to guitar lessons. All your metaphors and symbols and visions, whatever comes to you, confirms a sense of who you are as a warrior. But now you're 45 or 52, then what do you do with your true nature? So you look at the skill sets that you have developed. You look at your personality that you have developed. You look at what life's given you. And then you begin to think, how can I express my true nature through the skills that I do have? How do I fight and defend what I believe, my family, my country, my community, and utilize those skills? But you're channeling them through whatever it is that you're doing. Computer engineering, doctoring, nursing, singing, music, dance, whatever it is. That's your spiritual gift. That energy is what's going to have you realize your destiny. It's also part of how one perceives and understands the gifts that are coming. So that when something faces you, your training is that you can think it through from many different approaches and can understand it in many different ways, all of which can be true, from which we can derive information to then act. In order to live life fully and truly, we have to be at a comfort level with our multidimensional beings within a universe. It's this inclusive way of looking and perceiving and understanding everything. And it's about the paradox, because it's not to say that exclusion doesn't exist as a reality. It's to say, and the way that Jung put it was that we're always dealing with negotiating the tension between the opposites. The Buddha's way of putting that was we walk the middle road. And where the Buddha would say the middle is the way, we would say, to hell with mediocrity. That's the worst place you want to be, right? I mean, it's sort of this Western concept, dismay at sort of, living a mediocre life or being a mediocre human being or doing a mediocre job or, and yet it's in that middle balance place where you have your feet on the ground. It's looking at life in a multi-level way. And it's not about this or that, but it's also about this or that. Depending on the situation at hand will depend on what's required. Does it require a rational, logical thinking process whose culmination is a concrete decision? Do I take this job or do I take this job? Do we go to Africa next year for a vacation, or shall we go to Rapa Nui and hang out with the big old beautiful rock faces? Am I going to get really angry with this person because I have a righteous ground to be angry with this person? Or am I going to step down, am I going to stand back, and am I going to think about it first? Where will the outcome of me expressing my anger take this encounter? Will it be good because it's about tough love? Or will it not really have any kind of outcome from which something could be built? So there are those levels of decision making, My kid needs me, or I just had a fight with my girlfriend or my wife the night before, and we just need to really take a couple of hours off work, go get breakfast, make things nice, make things good again. So there's all those levels of decisions that really are about what's more important, what's less important, what takes priority right now, what doesn't take priority right now. But then at the very same time, there's also that level of the moves that you make in your life that you feel have to do with sort of shifting or moving your fate, your future, your past, in sort of those big ways. It may be going back to India and getting a job, or going to Australia. It may be, do I marry this person or not marry this person? Then you go into your deepest core as your guide. And if you can't go into your deepest place and your own guiding voice doesn't inform you, you go into the surrendered place. And once again, we go into this metaphorical world, what Jung called a mythopoetic world, where it's about images and symbols and vision, where you look at a situation and sometimes you have to ask the situation, what do you require from me in terms of my interactive dynamic with you? Do you require for me to go into a place of surrender to the will of the sacred? In Zen, there's the whole notion of that flow, that non-resistance. Or it might be the forging out on the path, right? The great adventurer, the pathfinder. You look at the path, you look at the trajectory, and you know that you're going to take it. I mean, that's your energy, And you go around collecting your tools. And when you're ready to walk that path, you're on that path. And you've got everything that you need because you understand what that path is. It's a path of struggle. It's a path of beauty. It's a path of grace. Whatever, it's an obstacle course. You start from the point of knowing that there's no choice but to walk down it. And Jung also talks about, and this goes back to the call, that you're called out to walk down that path, or you're called out to walk up that mountain, in a sense that you're just thrown there. I mean, you're in the middle, you're in there. There's nothing to do but survive. There's nothing to do but walk it, right? You either walk back out or you walk up, but you're there and you can't stay there. A move is essential. The move is imperative, that action. Is it surrender and flowing? Or is it where you are actively, proactively, assertively, maybe even possibly aggressively moving wherever it is that you need to move? That would be your individuation process. That would be your process to self-discovery and finding your wholeness. We also need to know when we can't walk a road anymore. It's almost impossible for me as a woman now to walk a traditional religious road. Because in principle, not only as a woman, but as a human being beyond my womanhood, the human being that I've become will not allow me to take a position and stand behind certain philosophical principles in relationship to women in traditional world religions. You know, I converted to Islam 30 years ago, primarily to really walk the Sufi path, and the traditional historical Sufi path, where you become a Muslim if you're going to be a Sufi. But, you know, I realized that there's no place for me in that world as a woman, period. I had to actually make my farewells and leave that path. There's checkpoints all along the way in life, right? Crossroads, that's a very archetypal experience, where you check, am I to walk through this portal? Am I to walk through this gateway and continue? With the Buddhist trajectory, for me, that first time where I read, and I really forget which sacred text it was in, Ananda's telling the story during the time of Buddha to some devotees, and he talks about this monk who is walking along the road, and he's got his begging bowl, and he's walking along, and this young woman comes up to him to give him some rice. And he puts the bowl out, and he's very grateful, and he accepts the rice and the milk and everything. And then he thanks her, and she smiles. And that smile showed this monk hell. This woman was hell incarnate. She was samsara in her smile. She was everything that this monk had to leave behind and be terrified of. She symbolized the nth degree of the worst that you can imagine on a spiritual path. So, you know, to me, when I learned that story, I'm like, well, okay, in principle, I love the Lord Buddha. In principle, I follow his teachings, but I would not, and I could not, be a Buddhist because of that story and because of that woman and that smile. Why? Because I stand by that woman. And I will fight and die for that woman's right to smile and to believe that that smile gives joy to the Creator and not power to samsara. Well, that's a universal story you find in, you know, every religious tradition. There's also this tension, you know, as we move onto our spiritual path and into our spiritual journeys, that we have to know our own truth, and we have to know what we will stand firm on and not be moved. And there's a great beauty and power in that. You know, there's that immovable being. But once again, within that immovable being is that flowing, forever flexible being. the sacred resides in every single living atom in the created universe and voices itself through every single living atom in the universe. Within our own body being, this human body being, there's uncountable numbers of beings that live and function to keep it alive, right? Every single one of them voices itself all the way into the genetic and the phylogenetic memory. The spirit being that we are, that I believe is eternal and infinite, that for this finite moment resides in this particular body that we're in this lifetime. In the same way, this body being is a being in and of itself. I live in her, and she informs me, and she speaks to me. Instinct, intuition, emotion, senses, and that includes our reasoning faculties and our logical faculties. And I think that the value is co-equal in terms of listening to your body being, listening to your own logical thought patterns that help make decisions, that help heal your body, listening to what might be genetically based information. So, the notion of past lives and lives to come, that we continue to live out the trajectories of our ancestors, that those genetic stories are living themselves out through us. When Jung talks about archetypes and archetypal stories, he talks about that phylogenetic memory, which is memory that's even before we were human. And then into our genetic memory codes, there's this thing about carrying on the sins of your forefathers, and I would say the sins of your foremothers, and but also the fates and the destinies and the gifts and the greatness of our ancestors, right? And to really honor that. And then there's the other being. That's your personality, your ego. There's, this person called Ismana. And then there's person that lives in me that has no name. Because beings don't have names out from this world. It's different. The existence is different outside this body and outside this solar system. Everything's different. There's nothing that a human can reference. So there's that being, but then there's this being right here in this life. There's this Ismana who has this body. My body is a being and is co-equal in value to the spirit that lives in her. And so her information to me is co-equally critical to my survival as spiritual information is to my spirit. Yeah? And the fact is that it's in her that when I leave her, it's she who informs my spirit of the genetic code. She's the one that has my spirit leave with all that ancestral history. And that's how karma works. Depending on how much I leave with that will depend on where then I return, if I return, or where I go. We've split, the spiritual and the sacred from the material and the concrete, the measurable and the scientific. And then we've put value on it. The reasoning mind, the rational thinking mind, has much more value than the imagining, unreal, unprovable kind of mumbo jumbo, right? It's all put in that other category. We've done a disservice to both aspects of our reality. There's a reasoning element and component to the irrational being, to the unreasoning being. It's a different kind of logic. It's not a brain logic. It's a spirit logic. There's a logic of the spirit that the brain is not able to apprehend. And in the same way, there's a logic the logic of the brain oftentimes is difficult for the spirit to apprehend or comprehend. Because we split the two, we've taken the ability of the reasoning mind to be informed by the intuitive mind, and vice versa. And so we've reduced the power of the two. Our intuitive knowledge is derived from our cellular base of wisdom. Our instinctive knowledge is derived from our physical base of wisdom. But we've devalued that because it's not measurable. You can't measure instinct or intuition, but you can measure the thinking mind. Our task is to bridge the divide. We're not saying devalue the mind and logic and reason. We're saying infuse it with the spirituality. James Hillman, who's a great depth psychologist, he talks about the thinking heart and the feeling mind. That's what we're talking about. So our job is to really bring back the notion of love in, once again, in all of the dimensions of that emotion. You know, I mean, other cultures have language. That language is love in all of its different aspects, right? And if you can language your emotion appropriate to that emotion, you can safely express it. That's the power of what we've lost in the West and in the English language. It's become commodified. It's become reduced. It's become materialized. I mean, there's just one word, love. And you can't do much with that one word. My very profound disappointment with Freud is that Freud sexualized the word and the notion of love to the detriment of every other kind of love. How does a daughter who passionately adores and loves her father, and vice versa, how do they show that and express that to each other without being accused of going into the Electra complex? How can a son and a mother who adore and love each other express that without immediately it being looked as an Oedipal complex? We've taken out the ability for normal and powerful love connections. It becomes suspicious. Suddenly you're in a dysfunctional mode. In other cultures, I mean, fathers have their arms around their daughters, they're holding hands, brothers and brothers hold hands, friends hold hands, same-sex friends hold hands without being, worried that they're going to be considered to be gay, In this country, for me to walk on the streets and have my arm in my daughter's arm, who's an adult, young woman, and we're walking down the streets in Santa Cruz, it's obvious that, we walk down the street and many, many people look at us as if we're a couple. She's my daughter, for goodness sake. We've, in very extreme terms, deprived ourselves of being able to express overtly, be nurtured by, and enjoy loving each other in appropriate, loving terms. It's extraordinary what we've done. But when you think about the fact that in our relationship with the divine, in our relationship with the sacred, the experience is grounded in love, the radiant light of love. But we can't provide that and mirror that to each other. And I think in other cultures you can still do this. You see this, even on the Travel Channel, ceremonies in India and stuff. You see this sort of ecstatic expression of people's worship. I know when I was in India some years ago, I was at a Sufi mosque in Ramadan. And we had Qawwali singers and, people were getting up and going into trance. And It was just splendid, you know. But there you are in a safe environment, and for those communities, it's absolutely a norm that when the Spirit takes a hold of you, it takes a hold of you. And if it's going to lift you up and spin you, that's what it's going to do. If it's going to inspire your voice, and suddenly you're sort of belting out this amazing mantra or, holy song or whatever, poem, it's accepted. It's enjoyed. It was part of the fallout of the Enlightenment, the Age of Reason. There was no longer a place for spiritual experience. And I mean, I have to even say that there was no longer a place for inspiration. I mean, experiencing inspiration. So even within art, within literature, within painting, within music, everything becomes sort of logical and reasoning and scientized and intellectualized. And so the artist that really, moved into sort of inspired and irrational places was considered the mad artist instead of the visionary, mystically oriented experience. When the muse grabs a hold of you and takes you, it's an experience that's irrational. You become the food of the gods. And what we've done, with intellectualizing that and rationalizing that, we've put it into a world of insanity. Imagine Vincent van Gogh before the Age of Reason doing his art. Would he have cut his ear off, and would he have committed suicide? And would he have been such a despairing soul? I don't know, because there may have been a place for him to really go as far as he needed to go in his relationship, in his captivatedness with his muse. I don't know, but what a beautiful thought. What history has shown us is that human society cannot collectively live from a ground of love. And this is a mystery. You see, I love being human, and I love having a mind, and I love this whole thing because it's crazy. It's like you're in the middle of this insane soap opera. I ask myself, all right, Creator, what on earth were you thinking when you thought us up? I mean, what do we contribute? Really, the only thing that I can come up with that I love is that we are the equivalent of a romantic fantasy for the Creator. And we know that in human society, right, we realize our romantic fantasies in soap operas. And the romantic fantasy and the soap opera has a very particular foundation. It's the same story. It repeats, but people have different hairstyles, different fashions, the music's a bit different, etc., right? And I look at the story of the human race. It's the same story. Nothing has changed. Technology has changed. Our material tools have changed. But the story of our hearts and souls are the same. Love, betrayal, calling out for help, rescue. I'm fascinated with that. And the thing that's so mysterious is that we continue as human beings over, the millennia, we continue, number one, to not lose hope. We continue to try to love. We continue to deal with the disappointments, the frustrations and the betrayals, and the sense of hopelessness. And we continue to move forward in spite of it all. I just don't think there is an answer. And the really cool thing is that we will continue for the rest of the existence of the human species, be bound and determined to find it. And so I believe that we are the entertainment factor for the Creator on this little planet. And if you think about it, what is sort of the great thing that we do? We entertain. I think more hours than any are spent on producing entertainment and being entertained. I mean, this is archetypal. We are entertainers as a species. My job is to try and be as entertaining as I could possibly be, so that the Creator keeps me in its fantasy. Because you know, when we have a romantic fantasy, right? It keeps going based on how interesting the figures are in it. And when we're bored with that particular figure or characters, we lose the fantasy and we start a new one with new characters and a new storyline, right? No societies cannot live grounded in love. But we will not give up trying. But that is such a magnificent piece of the human spirit and of being human. Finding your own nature through nature really has to do with being willing to open yourself in every level to nature as sacred text. To be willing to accept that the divine speaks to us through nature. And that nature is, in its essence, sacred. I think of nature as the only sacred text that is still pure, that is unadulterated by the human mind and by human agenda. And I think of nature as the only sacred text that is inviolable. So then, how do you read nature as sacred text? And how do you hear nature as sacred text? And how do you understand nature as sacred text? It was an experience Jung shared in his own autobiography, Memories, Dreams, and Reflections. It's a client of his that had come to see him and had been seeing him for some months. She had been to see numbers of psychiatrists. She had been to clinics and really was in a state of very great depression and a state of sort of inner loss. She was really experiencing a sense of having lost herself and lost her way, really. And she was sitting with Jung in his office, in his home in Geneva. And it was in the afternoon, and she was describing a dream. In this dream, she had traveled, and it seemed that she was somewhere in Egypt. Somewhere in this dream, a golden scarab, sort of that beautiful emerald green gold scarab, was given to her as a gift, a live scarab. And she didn't really understand about this scarab, and she didn't understand why she was being given it as a gift. But somehow she felt it was important. And at that very moment that she began talking about this golden scarab, a golden scarab flew into the office, toward the office, and it kept fluttering and flying and crashing into the window. And Jung looked, and he saw it on the windowsill outside and realized that it was not exactly a golden scarab as you'd find in Egypt, but of the same family and the same genus. And it was beautiful. It was sort of emerald and gold. And he opened the window, and sat down, and the scarab flew in, and he caught it in his hand. And he held it there, this beautiful live scarab, and put it on the desk. And, Jung would call it a synchronous moment where something comes up from within yourself. There's a sort of an archetypal move from within yourself. Your soul is speaking. It's the voice of the soul. And then it's mirrored by nature. And for her, the scarab really symbolized hope for a new life, a new pathway. Everything changed for her. It was a key to a transformation, a full transformation within her being. And after that, she came and saw him a couple of more times, and then she was fine. I mean, her life just appeared again to her, the way the scarab had. In an experience like that for me, I would have then asked that scarab what it was there to tell her. I would have had her go into an imaginal meditation and gone into a dialogue with the scarab. And we would have sat and we would have really asked that creature what its lesson plan was, what its message was. It was a visitation in the profoundest sense of that term. And so what was the visit about? But Jung didn't do that. He stopped short of that. My job is to take it that next step. And you really engage with Earth in her form that she brought. I mean, Earth and her angel arrived to talk to that woman in an exact mirror image of that dream. That's about God. I mean, that's a God moment, But you would need to recognize it as that if you embraced nature and Earth in herself as sacred text. That's how she talks, right? And that's how you begin to grasp your own nature. So then, using the Jungian trajectory of therapy, then you would begin this whole process of association. You'd learn about that golden scarab in Egypt. You'd learn about the genus species in Switzerland. You'd learn about the migrations and the patterns. You'd learn about the symbolism and the stories. And then you'd begin to apply them to yourself, and in the process, learn about yourself, creating a disciplined relationship with your sacred text. So as an example, for a devout Muslim, well, you read the Quran every day. Well, you learn the Quran as a child, and you learn it so that you can actually recite it by heart. Or if you're a devout Buddhist and your sacred text happens to be the Lotus Sutra. If you're a Hindu, you may have the Upanishads, or you may have the Bhagavad Gita. You have your sacred text. If you're a Christian, you have the Bible. You're referencing your life by your sacred text. Well, that's what you would do with Earth, is you would reference your everydayness with nature as sacred text. I have this practice I call small disciplines. I will ask to have revealed to me a small discipline. This is part of my practice of engaging with nature as a living being, but also as sacred text. So, how do I acknowledge that I'm completely at one with, intertwined with, interconnected with all of life on this planet? That I'm in relations with all of life. For example, the Lakota in Native people will say, Ometaku oyasen. This is a sacred term that translated means all my relations. And you're always using that term, all my relations, in things that you do. And what you're saying is that you include and incorporate in everything you do, that you are representing and acting for and living for and being for all your relations, all living beings. If I go past a funeral or anything, I always have this moment, dear God, I send my blessings to that person and that family. I don't know them, but I send my blessings to them, a human being to a human being, an act of love, a loving thought. So I do that with every creature I see on the road that's been killed. And that's my small discipline, because as a discipline, it then turns into a practice, and then it becomes part of you like breathing, so that you no longer think about it anymore. It becomes part of your incorporated sense. Once again, it's engaging with nature as sacred text, because with that discipline, there's the teaching of how you think and you feel, and you automatically are inclusive of everything around you. And so everything needs a prayer at a given moment. When I started that discipline, it was a revelation. I mean, I really prayed and asked, I want to begin to practice being in connection with you consciously. You know, I just went into a vision. I left my body. I went into my car, visionarily speaking. I went on the road, and I began to see these relatives on the road that had been killed. In the voice that is her voice to me, I was told, pray for each of these, and I will hear your prayer for them, and they will know that you have prayed for them. They will know your prayer in their spirit existence. And the first time that happened, there was a raccoon on the road, newly killed raccoon. And this was on a commute track. It took about 5 weeks for that carcass to finally disappear, sort of into the ground of everything, right? The first day that I went by and I noticed that it was no longer there, and I said, Ometako Oyasen, that's my discipline. I'm acknowledging to you this relation and who the spirit of this being was and is wherever it is. And I drove by, and I felt behind me in the car, I felt these 2 little paws on my shoulder. And I felt this furry little head on the right-hand side of my head, rubbing and nuzzling me. I believe absolutely it was the spirit, and it is the spirit of that little raccoon. And I realized that it took that long, and that this little raccoon had about 5 or 6 weeks worth of prayers from me. Because the sighting, looking at the body, the sighting was my discipline. And I realized that if it had been a year, or I had seen the sight, the reminder of a spirit, that I would have, for a whole year, been sending my prayers of love and blessing from one being to another being. It's a kind of spiritual nutrient. And that the happiness of this little creature whose spirit I was feeling in the back on my body, that somehow it was thanking me for this certain kind of nutrient that somehow had assisted or helped or brought joy enough that it came to me to say thank you. And now there's hundreds of beings out there that I now know and know me through my prayer, through my acknowledgement. You know, imagine millions of humans doing that with each other and with all living beings. There's this kind of spiritual nutrient energy. And we know that that's real, right? We know that that's real. You sit in a room and there's a situation going on and someone's hurting, and you make an eye contact and they calm down. And it's mutual, it's between you, and somehow they acknowledge that they received that eye contact, that smile, that something that says, I'm with you. It's unspoken, it's energetic, but it had a concrete outcome. A calmness, a settledness, anxiety levels reduced, that bodily felt communication. But that's engaging with nature. It's an illustration, it's one illustration of a way that you begin to interact and encounter and relate to natural things exactly as you would to human beings. Your job is to go out there and apprehend the beauty and the liveness of everything. Our job is to go out into nature, and when we're out there, to say, "What a beautiful day! Thank you." The hawk crying in the morning, "Good morning, relative. I hear you. It gives me such joy to hear your cry." Our job is to take ourselves to her. Our job is to take ourselves to the divine. Our job is to be humble in the face of that which is far greater than us, and to actively bring ourselves forward. Driving yesterday in the car, there was a bumper sticker on the car in front of me. The bumper sticker said, "Those who rule the world and those who run the world are those who show up." And I think that that's exactly the same in the spiritual life. Those to whom the divine comes to, those to whom nature shows herself as sacred text, are those who show up to her party. And showing up to her party is, at any given moment, overtly appreciating and speaking and voicing and languaging our celebration of her. And when that happens, within the matrix of that celebration, which entails seeing, you've got to see and you've got to really apprehend and be dazzled by the thing that you're bringing yourself to and that you're praising. But then it's within that then you set the stage. You create the sacred space. You create the altar. You create the temple. You create the environment where then something extraordinary, like the golden scarab, happens. It comes to you in mysterious and extraordinary and unexpected ways. When that mysterious and unexpected encounter occurs, our responsibility is, how do we recognize it? Or are we willing to recognize it as that? I mean, the scarab hitting the door and the window pane to anybody else would just have been a scarab hitting the door and the window pane. And it would have been ignored. Or if it was annoying, a person would have opened the window and swatted it. Right? But no. What was Jung's response? It was that mythopoetic, inner, intuitive, accepting nature as a living reality response. I can also go into a mythopoetic, deeply sort of sacred move here, respecting myself as a soulful being and respecting that the language of the soul is the language of metaphor and symbol. And I am going to take this as a symbolic, synchronistic voicing from the sacred in its form as earth and sky, telling me that somewhere, someone or something is taking note. Somewhere this is being acknowledged, and somewhere this has some measure of value. And it's coming in this incredibly powerful way. If you're in a moment where you're consciously seeking for help, assistance, enlightenment, insight, support, and you're drawn out into nature to find that, and there's a very specific need that you have, and you take yourself out, and a particular event happens. A leaf falls from a tree and begins to float and fall before you, and you realize that you are noticing that leaf in a very particular way, as opposed to many other leaves that might be falling all around you. Then it's really up to you to look within yourself to say, is what I'm seeing relevant to my need that I've brought out here? And is what I'm seeing about a particular attitude that I need to have about a situation? That I have to surrender to the float and the movement of falling, letting things go, letting things fall where they may, and letting things land where they may. Is this something that I'm being shown here? The language of nature is not going to be anything like the language of the human being. And the logic in the languaging has nothing to do with the logic of the workings of the human mind. And once again, it's really up to that aware person to recognize a particular happening in a natural setting as particularly meaningful. A leaf falling from a tree may be a leaf falling from a tree, period. It's the meaning that you might give to that leaf falling from the tree based on a particular state of being or state of mind or framework that you're in at that moment. The golden scarab in and of itself is a creature in and of itself. What it signifies and what it signified to that woman mysteriously provided the exact key to unlock something within her that no one and nothing could unlock up until that point. And that it wasn't Carl Jung that unlocked it for her. It was a little golden scarab, a form of nature.